Has the world always existed, or did it begin to exist? And if it did begin to exist, then how? Countless scientists and philosophers have thought about this question for thousands of years, and many argue that the answer is not just relevant to science, but that it points directly to the existence of God. In summary, these people argue that 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. 2. The universe began to exist, so therefore, the universe has a cause for its coming into being. We'll be reviewing this argument to see if it really holds up to scrutiny. In general, for any argument to work, it needs two things. Its premises must be true, and its logic must be valid. An argument that meets these two criteria is called a sound argument, meaning that the argument really does work. By the way, if you're a returning viewer, feel free to like and subscribe. Anyways, we'll first review the logic of the argument without commenting on whether the premises are true. We can easily see here that the logic works. If the universe began to exist, then it can be substituted for whatever begins to exist. So if whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being, then the universe has a cause for its coming into being. Everyone actually already agrees with the logic of this argument, so we won't dwell on it. The usual way people disagree with it is actually by disagreeing with its premises. So let's review its premises and conclusion. To make it easy to understand and to avoid having to repeat the same explanation, we'll review these premises a little out of order. First, we'll review the second premise, which is the universe began to exist. Second, we will review the conclusion and why this cause would be God and not something else. And lastly, we'll review the first premise, which is whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. The primary piece of evidence that shows that the universe began to exist is the Big Bang Theory. In order to explain this properly, I may have to break my plain English rule, but bear with me, I will do my best to explain. Scientists today agree that the Big Bang Theory is the best explanation of how the universe came into existence. They openly admit that there are no alternative theories that even come close to explaining the data as well as the Big Bang Theory does. In summary, the Big Bang Theory states that at the beginning of the universe, space, time, matter, and energy all came into existence at once in a Big Bang. To clarify, you might be imagining a big explosion appearing out of nowhere in empty space. That is not the theory. The theory shows that space and time themselves also came into existence at the same time. There was no empty space, and there was no time before the Big Bang. After the Big Bang, space, time, matter, and energy are all expanding. It's not just matter expanding through empty space. Space and time themselves are also expanding, and they still are at this very moment. Imagine the universe as a balloon being inflated. It's not that the balloon is expanding into anything, but the rubber of the balloon itself is expanding. Also remember Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. That means energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. For clarity's sake, matter is that which has mass and takes up space. So energy and matter are interchangeable, and so they both came into existence at once, with space and time as well. To quote a scientist directly about this, Stephen Hawking, who is one of the world's most well-known physicists, said, "Almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang." Now some people have some questions and objections to the Big Bang Theory, so let's review those. The first objection is that people say the Big Bang Theory is just a theory and not proven fact. However, this is not following the evidence. The results of science, due to the very nature of science, are always tentative, meaning they are not guaranteed, but just the best explanations of the evidence. That is why scientists develop theories, like the theory of evolution, which explains how species evolved, or the atomic theory, which explains how atoms work, or plate tectonics, which explains how Earth's crust moves. These are technically theories, so yes, they are not proven to be true with philosophical certainty. However, all the evidence points towards these theories being true, and we continue to get more evidence that supports them as time goes on. These theories are as close to a sure thing as science can offer, and the same is true for the Big Bang Theory. One piece of evidence for the Big Bang Theory is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that in any closed system, entropy always increases. Entropy is basically a measure of disorder, so this means the universe naturally moves toward greater disorder over time. A simple example is heating a room. Once you turn on the heater, the warm air doesn't stay in one corner. It spreads out evenly throughout the space. For the universe, this has a dramatic consequence. Over time, all usable energy will eventually dissipate, leading to what physicists call heat death, a state where no work, no life, and no structure can exist. Like a car running until the tank is empty, the universe will eventually run out of usable energy. This matters for the question of whether the universe began to exist. If someone denies the Big Bang and claims the universe has always existed, then entropy would have been increasing forever. But if entropy had been increasing for an infinite amount of time, the universe would have already reached heat death long ago, since the universe acts as a closed system, and life would be impossible. Yet here we are, alive in a universe full of usable energy. That means the universe cannot have an infinite past. It must have begun to exist, and that is powerful evidence in favor of the Big Bang Theory, and the argument's second premise. Another objection is the idea that maybe the Big Bang Theory is true, except for the idea that there was nothing before the Big Bang. They think maybe after a universe experiences heat death, all the matter comes back together in what's called a big crunch or a big bounce. So they say that the universe has always existed and has been crunching and banging forever. However, the second law of thermodynamics also shows this cannot be the case for the same reason as just mentioned. If entropy had been increasing for an infinite amount of time, the universe would have reached heat death long ago, and life would be impossible. Also, according to our current understanding of physics, if the universe did crunch, then it would just form a black hole, not a Big Bang singularity. So again, the evidence does not support this view. Another piece of evidence is that scientists have observed that the universe is expanding from a single point. Again, remember, they are not just saying that matter is expanding, but space and time themselves are expanding. In fact, the expansion isn't even slowing down, it's actually speeding up. There's not any evidence to suggest that it will slow down either, which, if that's the case, a big crunch would be impossible. And even if the expansion does slow down, it would have to slow down enough in order for the forces of gravity to overtake the forces of expansion. We currently have no evidence that supports that view, but rather the contrary. However, even if a big crunch did happen, there is still the issue of entropy that shows even a crunching and banging universe would have to have a beginning. Another objection is that some people propose the idea of a steady-state universe. The idea is that the universe has always existed, but in a steady state. This proposal says that the second law of thermodynamics is wrong, and that entropy does not change. The universe runs without using any fuel. However, this idea was put to rest when scientists discovered what is called the cosmic background radiation. Basically, when the Big Bang theory was proposed, it was predicted that if it is true, then there would be a detectable afterglow from the explosion, and scientists discovered this afterglow in 1965. This discovery was so monumental that the scientists who discovered it won the Nobel Prize for it. This discovery killed the idea of a steady-state model universe, and Fred Hoyle, one of the three men who came up with a steady-state model, admitted that the cosmic background radiation was an important piece of evidence against his model. He said, "It is widely believed the existence of the microwave background killed the steady-state cosmology. Here in the microwave background was an important phenomenon which I had not predicted." The reason he disliked the Big Bang theory was precisely because it implied that the universe was created and that there is a creator. He said the Big Bang theory was too similar to God saying, "Let there be light" in Genesis, and that it was like medieval theology. Once the radiation was discovered and effectively killed the steady-state model, many scientists sought to gather more evidence for or against the theory. If the Big Bang theory is true, then it is predicted that there would be slight variations in the background radiation that would allow matter to attract and gather into galaxies. These variations are the ripples of the explosion, so to speak. So NASA launched a satellite called COBE, which stood for Cosmic Background Explorer. COBE would detect if there were any variations and how precise those variations were. What it discovered has been called the most important discovery of the century, if not of all time, by Stephen Hawking. It discovered what's called the seeds of the galaxies. Not only were the variations there as predicted by the Big Bang theory, but they were extremely precise. They were strong enough to allow matter to attract each other to form galaxies and planets like ours, but not too strong that the universe could collapse back onto itself. The precision is 1 part in a 100,000. If there was any slight variation, then the Earth would have never formed and life would not exist. George Smoot, the project leader for the COBE satellite, said that the precisions of the ripples were like the fingerprints of the Maker, and, if you're religious, it's like looking at God. The last piece of scientific evidence we'll be looking at is Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity, which is another theory that is as close to a sure thing as science can offer. As Einstein developed his theory, he realized that it implied that the universe has a beginning. Einstein at the time did not believe the universe had a beginning. He believed in the steady-state model. So in an attempt to fix this implication from his theory, he added what is called the cosmological constant. It changed the equations in such a way that his theory would no longer necessarily imply that the universe began, but rather it could have always existed in a steady state. However, later in his life, it was discovered that general relativity would require the universe to be expanding from a beginning and not a static state. The physicist George Gamow said that Einstein called the cosmological constant his greatest blunder. There is no direct documentation that Einstein actually said those specific words, but there is documentation that he expressed that it was a blunder in other words. Einstein said, "Away with the cosmological term. I always had a bad conscience. I found it very ugly. Such a constant appears unjustified." So Einstein admitted that the universe did have a beginning. However, after his life, it was discovered that the expansion of the universe was speeding up, like we mentioned before. And so even though the cosmological constant was at first an unnecessary blunder, ironically, it is actually an important part of the equations today. However, it still does not justify the idea that the universe has always existed. It only justifies that the expansion is speeding up due to what scientists call dark energy. I bring that up because many people will hear that the cosmological constant is actually not a blunder anymore, and mistakenly assume that that means the current theory predicts the universe has always existed. But that is not what the current theory shows. The last objection to the idea that the universe began to exist is the multiverse. When you look at the evidence, people realize our universe began to exist, so they will admit our universe began, but they will propose that our universe began within an eternally existing multiverse. However, the cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin worked on a theorem called the Bordguth-Vilenkin theorem, and he said, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." He said this because some people try to escape the problem of the universe have a beginning by saying our universe must be part of some eternally existing multiverse. But Vilenkin's theorem shows that, even if a multiverse does exist, the multiverse itself must still have a beginning if it is on average expanding. And all the evidence we have suggests that, if a multiverse does exist, then it would be on average expanding. That is why he says that, there is no escape. Scientists have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So if a multiverse does exist, then the evidence points to the multiverse itself having a beginning. And then the argument for God is even stronger, because God would not merely be the cause of a universe, but also a multiverse. To be clear, I am not saying that there is a multiverse. We do not have any evidence to suggest that, and I'm not going to increase the strength of my argument without due reason. I just bring up the idea to show that according to the scientific evidence, all signs point to the fact that the universe began to exist, or even if there is a multiverse, that the multiverse began to exist. So we've shown the evidence from the Big Bang for premise 2, which is the universe began to exist, and we show that the evidence contradicts the idea that the universe has existed in an infinite steady state, or in an infinite series of bangs and crunches, or even as a finite part of an infinite multiverse. Some Christians have realized the importance of this evidence, and they summarize it with the acronym SURGE to make it easy to remember. SURGE stands for the second law of thermodynamics, the universe's expansion is accelerating, radiation from the Big Bang, galaxy seeds, and Einstein's theory of general relativity. I would also like to add to this acronym the Bordguth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV for short. So remember, in the beginning there was a blue-green-violet surge. This acronym will help us remember the scientific evidence for the second premise, the universe began to exist. Now online you will hear people defending the second premise, the universe began to exist, from grounds of logic alone without using scientific observation. Many people will argue that just like it is impossible for an immortal being to count all the numbers from 1 to infinity and to get to a last number, that it also must be impossible for there to be an infinite past behind us, because then today would be the day after an infinite amount of days, a last number, so to speak. However, I do not think that these purely philosophical arguments work for various reasons. I'm not opposed to a philosophical argument being made for them, but I'm not convinced you can prove that the past cannot be infinite with philosophical certainty. I think it could be possible to think of a universe that has always existed from a reason alone perspective that does not take science into account. I'm not going to go into detail in this video about this reason alone approach, because again, I do not use logic alone to defend the second premise. I think science has great evidence for it, and that should be our primary evidence for the fact the universe began to exist. But I will link some information in the description about why I think it's possible if you want to look into that more. So you may have been sitting there the whole time, convinced that the universe began to exist, but wondering, why does the cause for its beginning have to be God? Here's why the conclusion points to God. Like we mentioned, the scientific evidence shows that all of physical reality had a beginning. Space, time, matter, and energy all had a beginning and came into existence at once. That means whatever caused them to come into being has to be a non-physical, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and transcends energy itself, yet has the power to create all of physical reality without physical reality. The evidence shows that this cause exists, and whether we like it or not, the description of this cause is a description of God. A spiritual being, and by spiritual I mean non-physical, a spiritual being that transcends the universe and created it and has cosmic levels of power. Yeah, sounds a lot like God. Now you might be rightly pointing out that those are not all the attributes of God that we talked about in the previous episode, and you're right. However, I'm not trying to prove all the attributes of God with this argument. This argument just proves his existence. We can use more arguments about what attributes God must have after we establish that he exists. And if some attributes, like being timeless, for example, are proven along the way, then great. But that's not the primary goal of the argument. This argument merely attempts to prove that he exists, not that he is Jesus Christ. Remember, we're taking one step at a time, and every step has to be severely criticized and hammered out and argued against from every angle before we're actually going to take that step. Speaking of criticism, Stephen Hawking objected that since before the Big Bang there was no time, that means there was no time for God to exist within, and therefore that there is no God. However, God is timeless. Asking, when does God exist if there is no time to exist in, is a word salad. It's like asking, when did the number 2 exist? The statements have no coherent meaning. God does not exist within time, so the fact that there was no time before the Big Bang does not disprove that he exists. On the contrary, it is evidence for it. Similarly, someone might object, why can't the cause of the universe just be nothing? If nothing exists, then there are no rules to guide the nothing. Therefore, there are no rules to prevent something from coming from nothing. Nothing can do anything. However, this objection misunderstands what nothing means. Nothing is not an empty canvas. Nothing is what your elbow sees. Nothing is not a positive thing that exists and so can cause things to happen. Nothing is non-existence. The idea that nothing caused the universe is not a coherent thought. Again, it's just a word salad. In our minds, nothing might be thought of like a thing that exists positively and can cause things, but it's only because our minds are imperfect and incapable of imagining nothing, because there's literally nothing to imagine, just like our mind is incapable of imagining God outside of time. Saying nothing caused the universe means that you are misunderstanding the word nothing, or you think the universe wasn't caused. It's like saying that the number 2 caused the universe to exist. Nothing and the number 2 have no causal power, whereas the concept of a non-physical being that does have the causal power to create a universe is commonly called God. Also, some people will tell you that something really can come from nothing, because in quantum mechanics, there are virtual particles that pop in and out of existence for no reason. Now, can you see the problem here? Again, they are misunderstanding the concept of nothing. The particles pop in and out of existence from a quantum vacuum, and that's not nothing. A quantum vacuum has space, and so it is something. Before the Big Bang, there was no space at all. Which leads us to review the first premise, which is whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. We'll call this the law of causality for short. This law seems self-evident to most people, a necessary consequence of trusting logic. But some people object for various reasons. One of those reasons is because of what we mentioned in quantum mechanics. However, like we showed, the virtual particles that pop in and out of existence are popping due to a quantum vacuum, so there is a cause. Another objection is that the law of causality only applies to beings within the universe within time, and we cannot say that it applies to the universe itself, because we do not observe universes being caused like we observe other things being caused. However, causality is not dependent on time or confined to our universe. For example, on a stack of books, the top book is held up by the bottom book. It's not that the bottom book needs to exist in a time before the top book to hold it up. It's that they have a relationship of dependence regardless of time. So causality is not dependent on time. Causality is also not confined to within our universe. When we do reasoning at all, the reasoning is not limited to only applying within our universe. If logic is true, then it's true in all possible universes. 2 plus 2 is 4 in all possible realities. In fact, if that wasn't true, the concept of a multiverse would be incomprehensible, since we would not be capable of reasoning outside of our universe. Yet scientists treat the proposal seriously because logic is not defined by the circumstances of our universe. Rather, all possible circumstances are defined by logic. Some people object that the universe can just begin without a cause, but that's just special pleading. You cannot rationally say that whatever begins has a cause except the universe, unless you have some kind of rational justification. If an amputee began to miraculously grow back a leg, you would not be able to dismiss it. It would be a clear miracle, proving the existence of God. If the whole universe came into being from nothing like the leg, then it would also point to God. The fact it's the whole universe and not merely a leg should not lead us to dismiss it, but it should rather lead us to greater amazement. Another objection is that maybe the universe caused itself. However, this would require the universe to exist and to not exist in the same sense in order to be true. It would have to exist to have causal power to cause its beginning, and it would have to not exist in order to cause itself before its beginning. This clearly violates the law of the excluded middle. Some people might object that causation is just a human mental construct that describes our world, but not a real principle that reality follows. But if that were true, the entire scientific endeavor would not just not work, it wouldn't consistently and accurately produce results. Yet science does produce results, which is why you can watch this video at all to begin with. Also, not to mention, as we discussed in our second video in the series, we have to believe in logic if we're going to believe in anything at all. Lastly, someone could object that they simply have a great reverence for science and the unknown, and so they are not willing to say that the universe needs a cause or that the cause is God. However, this is not an argument. If you say, "We do not know, therefore there is no cause," or "We do not know the full nature of the cause, therefore the cause is not God," then that is just a textbook appeal to ignorance, which is a logical fallacy. Rather, we should follow the evidence where it leads. If you look into this topic, and I do encourage you to do that, you will find people online saying that we do not know for sure about the beginning of the Big Bang, and many similar objections that we talked about. And they are not wrong in one sense. Again, science is tentative. We do not know for certain. However, we are showing where the evidence does point to, and I recommend you look into what the current evidence does point to. In future videos, we will discuss proofs for God's existence that are certain and do not rely on tentative scientific findings, but rather only on solid philosophical reasoning. But in this video, we review the scientific evidence. We discovered that according to the evidence, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being, that the universe began to exist, and that therefore the universe has a cause for its coming into being. And when you look at what that cause must be, it must be a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, transcending energy, non-physical being, with the power to create a whole universe and to create all physical reality from no physical reality. The evidence undeniably points to the existence of God. Now, some people think God is just a cop-out. They can follow the logic and evidence, but they have faith that one day science will explain everything without God. They think that religion and belief in God prevent scientific investigation and progress. And that's the argument against God that we'll be covering next.